It started the way most disasters do, quietly, almost invisibly, like a crack in the drywall you don't notice until the whole ceiling comes down. I was standing in the middle of a party I didn't want to be at, holding a beer I wasn't drinking, watching my wife laugh at something her college friend said across the room. The music was too loud, the kind of thumping bass that vibrates up through the floor and settles in your chest like a second heartbeat. People were spilling out of the kitchen onto the back patio, their voices overlapping into that familiar white noise of a Saturday night in the suburbs. We were at the Harrisons' place, a sprawling modern farmhouse with more square footage than anyone needed, out in the kind of neighborhood where every lawn looks like it was trimmed with scissors and the HOA sends you a letter if your garbage can is visible from the street. I hated these gatherings, I always had. But Jenna loved them, loved the performance of it all, the way she could glide from group to group, her smile bright and easy, touching arms, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, collecting social currency like it was going to expire. I leaned against the granite island in the kitchen, my back to the refrigerator, watching her across the sea of bodies. She was wearing that blue dress, the one that made her eyes look like the kind of water you see in travel brochures, and her hair was pulled back in that loose, effortless way that probably took her an hour to perfect. She was beautiful. She was always beautiful, and for the past 3 years I had told myself that was enough. That the distance between us was just the natural settling of a marriage, the way things got comfortable and quiet after the initial fire burned down to embers. I told myself that the way she looked at me now with that polite, almost detached warmth was just what happened after you'd seen someone at their worst, after you'd paid bills together and argued about garbage disposals and survived the monotony of Tuesday nights. I told myself a lot of things, but tonight something was different, or maybe I was just finally paying attention. The air in the room felt thicker, charged with something I couldn't name. I watched her touch the arm of a man I didn't recognize, tall, dark hair, the kind of sharp jawline that looked like it belonged on a cologne ad. He was leaning in, saying something in her ear, and she threw her head back and laughed in that way that was supposed to be carefree but actually sounded a little desperate, a little too loud. I felt a familiar twitch in my jaw, that muscle that tightens when I'm trying not to feel something. I looked away, took a sip of my beer, which had gone warm and flat. I scanned the room, hoping to find a familiar face I could actually stand talking to, but everyone was in their own orbit, spinning around their own little dramas. That's when I saw her. She was standing by the sliding glass doors that led out to the patio, half in the shadow of the curtain, a glass of white wine in her hand. She wasn't looking at anyone in particular, just watching the crowd with a kind of detached amusement, like she was a naturalist observing a strange species. Her hair was a deep, dark brown, almost black, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and she had this way of standing that was completely still, completely in control. She wasn't trying to be the center of attention, she was just there, and something about her stillness made the rest of the room feel frantic and loud. I didn't know her, I was sure I'd never seen her before. She wasn't one of Jenna's old sorority sisters or a coworker from her marketing firm. She didn't have that polished, perfectly curated look that everyone else in this room seemed to have. There was something raw about her, something unfinished. Her dress was simple, a black slip that didn't scream for attention, and her only jewelry was a thin gold chain around her neck. She looked around the room slowly, her eyes moving past faces like she was looking for something specific, and then for a fraction of a second her gaze landed on me. It wasn't a stare, it wasn't a come-hither look, it was just a glance. A moment of recognition, like she saw me standing there, holding my warm beer, looking lost, and she understood exactly what that felt like. And then she looked away, back out at the patio as if I had already ceased to exist. But that 1 second felt like an hour. It felt like a crack in the drywall. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the feeling. I was being an idiot, I was projecting. I was so starved for any kind of real connection in my marriage that a random woman's glance had me spiraling. I pushed off from the counter and made my way through the crowd, not to talk to her but just to move, to break the spell. I needed fresh air. I needed to get away from the noise and the pressure and the way Jenna was now leaning way too close to the tall man, her hand on his chest as she laughed. I squeezed past a group of people debating the merits of some obscure investment, my shoulder brushing against a woman who was wearing so much perfume I could taste it. I finally made it to the back door and stepped out onto the patio. The air was cool and clean, a welcome relief from the stuffy heat inside. The backyard was enormous, with a pool that glowed a soft turquoise in the darkness and a fire pit surrounded by Adirondack chairs where a few people were huddled, their faces lit by the orange glow. I walked to the edge of the patio, away from the noise, and stood looking out at the dark lawn, the line of trees that marked the edge of the property. I took a deep breath, trying to slow my heart rate, which was pounding for no good reason. I felt like I was on the verge of something, like I was about to be sick, or maybe just about to do something incredibly stupid. I heard her before I saw her, the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path next to the patio. I turned and she was there, walking towards the back of the yard, her glass of wine still in her hand. She was leaving the party. She was just walking away from it all like it was nothing. I should have let her go. I should have turned back to the pool and the fire pit and the safe, boring people, but I didn't. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding rougher than I intended. She stopped and turned, and I felt that same jolt of stillness, that same sense of being seen. Up close, she looked younger than I'd first thought, maybe late 20s, with a scattering of freckles across her nose that were barely visible in the dim light. Her eyes were a dark, steady gray, and they held mine without flinching. "Sorry," I said, taking a step towards her. "I didn't mean to, I just saw you walking out here. You're leaving?" She gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "Yeah, it's a bit much in there, all that energy." She gestured vaguely with her wine glass towards the house, where the muffled thump of music and the roar of voices continued unabated. "Yeah," I agreed, feeling a sudden, desperate need to keep her talking. "It's a lot. I'm Mark, by the way. I don't think we've met. I'm married to the blonde in the blue dress, Jenna." I pointed towards the house, hating how I immediately had to define myself by my wife. Her smile widened slightly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Lee, and yeah, I know who you are." She said it simply without inflection, but it stopped me cold. "You do?" I asked, my heart doing that weird skipping thing again. "Sure, you're the one whose wife is the life of the party." She tilted her head, studying me, and I felt like she was peeling back layers of my skin. "You always stand in the corner looking like you're being held hostage." I let out a surprised laugh, a short, sharp bark of sound that was more self-deprecating than humorous. "Is it that obvious?" "It's a gift," she said, and for the first time there was a flash of warmth in her eyes. "Reading people, it's how I stay sane at these things." "Sane," I repeated, the word tasting strange on my tongue. "I don't remember what that feels like." I was rambling. I was standing in the dark backyard of a house I didn't like, talking to a stranger who somehow saw right through me, and I couldn't stop. I felt like I'd been holding my breath for 3 years, and she had just given me permission to exhale. She looked down at her glass, swirling the remaining wine. "Your wife is very good at it, you know, the party thing. She makes it look easy." "She makes everything look easy," I said, and I didn't try to hide the bitterness in my voice, it just slipped out. Lee looked up at me, and her gaze was sharp, assessing. She didn't look away, and she didn't offer any platitudes. She just looked at me, and in that quiet, charged moment, I knew I was in trouble. I knew I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and all I could feel was the wind. The crack in the drywall was getting wider. I was seeing something I was supposed to ignore, feeling something I was supposed to suppress. She didn't look away from me, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that if I gave her the chance, she would look right through every single lie I had ever told myself, and I was terrified that I wanted her to. "Well," she said finally, her voice soft, almost lost to the night air. "It's a nice view out here." I knew she wasn't talking about the trees, and I knew with a sickening lurch in my stomach that I was about to do something I could never take back. I was going to look at her, and I was going to let her see everything. The guilt, the anger, the years of quiet desperation, the loneliness, all of it. Because for the first time in what felt like forever, someone was actually looking at me. I stood there in the dark, the sounds of the party fading into a dull roar behind me, and I felt like I was watching myself from a great distance. Like I was a character in a movie I'd seen before, and I knew exactly what was coming next, but I was powerless to stop it. Lee was still looking at me, those gray eyes unreadable in the dim light, and I realized I had been silent for too long. The moment was stretching out, elastic and dangerous, and I needed to say something, anything to break the spell before I did something truly stupid. But my mouth felt like it was full of cotton, and the only thing I could think about was how close she was standing, close enough that I could smell her perfume. Something subtle and clean like rain on dry earth, completely unlike the heavy, floral scent Jenna wore like armor. "You okay?" Lee asked, and there was no mockery in her voice, just genuine curiosity. She tilted her head slightly, and a strand of dark hair fell across her cheek. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Something like that, I managed, my voice rough. I cleared my throat and took a step back, putting a few more inches of space between us. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like I was physically trying to hold myself together. "I should probably get back inside. Jenna will wonder where I am." Lee's lips curved into a small, knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Will she, though?" The question hung in the air between us, sharp and uncomfortable. She was right, and we both knew it. Jenna wouldn't wonder where I was. She was too busy being the center of her own universe, too busy laughing at the tall man's jokes, too busy collecting adoration like it was oxygen. I could have walked out the front door and driven home, and she probably wouldn't have noticed until the party wound down and she needed someone to hold her hair back while she vomited into the toilet. The thought was bitter and familiar, and I hated how easily Lee had seen through the facade I'd spent years constructing. I should go, I said again, but I didn't move. My feet felt rooted to the gravel like the ground had reached up and grabbed hold of my shoes. I was lying to myself and I knew it. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to watch my wife flirting with some stranger while pretending everything was fine. I didn't want to stand in the corner with my warm beer and my hollow smile, counting down the minutes until I could crawl into bed beside a woman who felt more like a roommate than a partner. I wanted to stay here in the dark with this woman who saw me for exactly what I was and didn't flinch. Lee seemed to read all of this on my face because she didn't push me to leave. Instead, she turned and walked a few steps towards the edge of the yard where the grass met the tree line and sat down on a large flat rock that was half hidden in the shadows. She crossed her legs and looked up at me, patting the space beside her like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Come on," she said. "Sit with me for a minute. The night's too nice to waste on that circus in there." I hesitated for a long moment, my brain screaming at me to go back inside to find Jenna to play my role. But my feet were already moving, carrying me towards her like they had a mind of their own. I sat down on the rock, not too close but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her body. The rock was cold through my jeans and I shivered slightly, but I didn't move away. We sat in silence for a while, looking out at the dark trees. The sounds of the party seemed very far away now, muffled and indistinct. A dog barked somewhere in the distance and an owl hooted from the branches above us. The night was alive in a way that the inside of the house wasn't, and I felt something loosen in my chest, something I hadn't even realized was tight. "So," Lee said eventually, her voice soft and conversational, "how long have you been unhappy?" I turned to look at her, my mouth open in surprise. "What makes you think I'm unhappy?" She laughed, a low melodic sound that didn't match the sharpness in her eyes. "Mark, come on, I'm not an idiot. You've got that look, the one that says you're in a cage and you can't find the key." I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that I had a great life, a beautiful wife, a nice house, a decent job. I wanted to recite the script I'd been rehearsing for years, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I heard myself saying, 3 years since I realized I married a stranger. It was the first time I'd said it out loud, the first time I'd admitted it to anyone, even myself. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air out of my lungs. 3 years of waking up next to someone I didn't recognize. 3 years of pretending that the spark was still there, that the love we'd once shared was just hiding somewhere waiting to be found. 3 years of slowly, inexorably suffocating. Lee didn't say anything. She just nodded like she understood perfectly. And somehow that was worse than if she had argued with me. Her acceptance of my pain made it feel more real, more permanent. "I don't even know how it happened," I continued, the words tumbling out of me like water through a broken dam. "We were so in love, we were the kind of couple people envied. We finished each other's sentences, we couldn't keep our hands off each other, and then one day it was just gone, like someone had flipped a switch. She started caring more about her career, about her image, about what people thought of her, and I stopped mattering. I was rambling, the years of frustration spilling out in a messy, unedited flood. I told her about the dinners where Jenna spent more time on her phone than talking to me, the vacations that felt more like photo shoots than actual getaways, the nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all there was. I told her about the little resentments that had piled up like stones, one on top of the other, until they formed a wall so high I couldn't see over it anymore. Lee listened without interrupting, her head tilted, her eyes fixed on me in the darkness. She didn't offer advice or try to make me feel better. She just listened, and that was exactly what I needed. I realized I had been starving for someone to just listen to me without judgment, without trying to fix me. When I finally ran out of words, I felt lighter, like I had been carrying a weight I hadn't even known was there. I let out a long, shaky breath and looked down at my hands, which were trembling slightly. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to dump all that on you. You're a stranger. You don't need to hear my sob story." But Lee shook her head, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle. "Sometimes it's easier to tell a stranger the truth. No expectations, no history, just two people in the dark." She was right, and the realization made my chest ache. In 3 years of marriage, I had never told Jenna any of this. I had never told her how lonely I was, how desperate I felt, how much I needed her to see me. I had been too proud, too afraid of looking weak, too convinced that if I just tried harder, things would magically get better. And all that time, the distance between us had only grown wider until it felt like an ocean I couldn't cross. Lee shifted on the rock, turning to face me more fully. "What are you going to do about it?" The question caught me off guard. I had spent so long avoiding that question, burying my head in the sand and hoping things would somehow resolve themselves. But now, with her gray eyes boring into mine, I couldn't look away. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know if there's anything I can do. We're in too deep. The house, the life, the expectations. We're trapped. We're all trapped, Lee said softly. The question is whether we stay in the trap or find a way out. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I realized I knew nothing about her. She was a stranger in the dark, a voice in the night, and yet she had seen more of me in the past 20 minutes than my own wife had in 3 years. It was terrifying and exhilarating and deeply, deeply wrong. What about you? I asked, trying to shift the focus away from my own misery. What's your story? Why are you at a party you clearly don't want to be at? Lee smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. I'm here with a friend. She dragged me along, said I needed to get out more, meet people, but I'm not really a people person. She paused, and I saw something flicker in her expression, something guarded and vulnerable. I got out of a bad relationship a few months ago, just trying to figure out who I am without him, you know. I nodded, even though I didn't really know. My identity was so wrapped up in being Jenna's husband that I had no idea who I was without her. The thought was paralyzing. He didn't see me either, Lee continued, her voice barely above a whisper. After a while, you start to think that's just how it is, that you're invisible, that the person you love is just going to walk around you like you're not even there. She let out a bitter laugh. It's a hell of a thing to be lonely when you're not alone. The words hit me right in the chest, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of connection to this woman. She understood. She got it. She had been through the same thing I was going through, and she had survived. I wanted to reach out and touch her, to feel something real and solid in the midst of all the chaos, but I held myself back. I was still a married man. I still had a wife inside that house, no matter how distant she felt. She's cheating on me, I heard myself say, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I didn't even know if it was true, but it had been gnawing at me for months, a dark suspicion I couldn't shake. The late nights at work, the secretive phone calls, the way she'd flinch when I walked into the room. I had convinced myself I was being paranoid, but now, with the truth of my marriage laid bare, it seemed inevitable. Lee didn't look surprised, she just gave a slow, deliberate nod. I figured as much. I blinked, shocked. What, how? The way you talked about her, she said. The way you looked at her through the window before you came out here. There's a distance there, a wall, and walls don't build themselves, Mark. They build around secrets. I wanted to argue, but I knew she was right. I had felt the wall growing between us for years, and I had done nothing to tear it down. I had just let it grow, stone by stone, until it was so high I couldn't see the other side. I don't have proof, I admitted. Just a feeling, a really bad feeling. Sometimes feelings are all we have, Lee said, and they're usually right. She reached out then, her hand brushing against mine on the cool stone. It was a small gesture, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it sent a jolt through me like I had been electrocuted. I looked down at her hand, pale and slender in the darkness, and I felt a dizzying urge to turn my palm up and lace my fingers through hers. I couldn't, but I wanted to. God, I wanted to. We should probably get back, I said, my voice hoarse. I pulled my hand away and stood up, my legs shaky beneath me. They'll start looking for us. Lee stood too, brushing off her dress. You're probably right, but she didn't move toward the house. She just stood there looking at me, and I felt like I was drowning in those gray eyes. You know what I think, she said, her voice low. I think you're scared, and I think you should be. Because you're about to make a decision that's going to change everything. What decision? I asked, even though I already knew. She stepped closer, close enough that I could feel her breath on my cheek. You're going to have to choose, Mark, between what you have and what you want, between the cage and the risk, and you're going to have to do it soon because you can't keep living in the middle. It'll destroy you. I wanted to kiss her. I wanted to grab her and pull her close and kiss her until I forgot my own name. I wanted to forget about Jenna and the house and the empty marriage and everything that had brought me to this moment. I wanted to be free, but I was a coward. I was a coward who had spent 3 years hiding from the truth, and I couldn't find the courage to change now. I have to go, I said again, and this time I meant it. I turned and walked back toward the house, my heart pounding in my ears. The image of Lee's face burned into my mind. I didn't look back. I couldn't, because if I looked back, I would have lost myself completely. The party was still going strong when I stepped back inside, the noise and the heat hitting me like a physical wall. I scanned the room for Jenna, and I found her exactly where I'd left her, still laughing at something the tall man was saying, her hand still resting on his chest. She looked up as I approached, and for a second I saw something flash in her eyes. Guilt? Surprise? I couldn't tell. It was gone too quickly. There you are, she said, her smile bright and brittle. I was wondering where you went. Just needed some air, I said, my voice flat. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I realized I didn't know her at all. The woman I had married was a stranger, a ghost wearing my wife's face. The tall man excused himself, and Jenna turned to me with a frown. What's wrong? You look like someone died. I almost laughed. Someone had died tonight. The last shred of denial I had been clinging to. The last hope that my marriage was salvageable. It was dead, and it had been dead for a long time. Nothing, I said. I'm fine, but I wasn't fine. I was anything but fine. I was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss, and all I could think about was the woman in the black dress who had seen right through me. Jenna touched my arm, her fingers cold and distant. Come on, lighten up. It's a party, try to have some fun. Fun, right? Because watching your wife flirt with another man while your own life crumbles around you is a real laugh riot. I pulled away from her touch and walked to the bar, pouring myself a glass of whiskey I didn't want. I threw it back in one gulp, feeling the burn slide down my throat, and poured another. The night was going to be long, and I needed all the numbness I could get. But even as I stood there, surrounded by people and noise and the desperate performance of happiness, I couldn't stop thinking about her. About Lee. About the way she had looked at me like I was the only person in the room. About the way she had made me feel seen. I was in trouble, deep, deep trouble, and I didn't know how to stop it. The week that followed was a masterclass in pretending. I went through the motions like a robot programmed to perform the role of a functioning husband, waking up at the same time, drinking my coffee in the same silence, driving to the same office where I stared at the same spreadsheets until my eyes glazed over. But underneath the surface, I was a live wire, crackling with restless energy that had nowhere to go. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart lurched with the hope that it might be her, even though I hadn't given Lee my number and had no way of contacting her. Every time I walked into a room, I scanned it unconsciously, searching for that dark hair, those gray eyes, that stillness that had cut through the noise of my life like a blade. She had disappeared into the night like a ghost, and I was left with nothing but the memory of her voice and the phantom sensation of her hand brushing against mine. Jenna, of course, noticed nothing. She was too busy with her own life, her own carefully curated existence that had very little room for me anymore. She left for work before I did and came home after, always with some excuse about a late meeting or a client dinner. She kissed me on the cheek when she walked through the door, a perfunctory peck that felt more like a habit than an expression of affection, and then she retreated to her home office or her phone or whatever shiny distraction was currently holding her attention. We existed in the same space, breathed the same air, slept in the same bed, but we were galaxies apart, separated by a distance that felt impossible to bridge. I started to notice things I had been willfully blind to for years. The way she angled her phone away from me when she was texting. The way she took her calls in the other room, her voice dropping to a murmur I couldn't quite hear. The way she wore that perfume I didn't recognize, the one that smelled like expensive flowers and secrets. She was having an affair. I knew it with a certainty that settled in my gut like a stone, cold and heavy and undeniable. I didn't have proof, not the kind that would hold up in court, but I didn't need it. The signs were everywhere, written in the language of a woman who had already checked out of her marriage and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent 3 years feeling invisible, and now I was finally seeing clearly, and what I saw was a nightmare. My wife, the woman I had promised to love and cherish until death did us part, was giving herself to someone else. And the worst part, the part that made me want to scream, was that I didn't even care as much as I should. I was angry, yes, hurt, absolutely. But there was also a strange, twisted sense of relief, like I had been handed a permission slip to stop trying. She had broken the contract first. She had been the one to stray, and that meant I was free. But free to do what? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Free to call Lee if I could find her. Free to pursue the dangerous, electrifying connection I had felt in that dark backyard. Free to blow up my entire life and start over from the ashes. It was terrifying and exhilarating, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I spent that entire week in a fog, going through the motions at work but not really present. My colleague Dave, who sat in the cubicle next to mine, noticed something was off. He was a good guy, the kind of person who wore his heart on his sleeve and had a habit of saying exactly what was on his mind. "You look like shit," he told me on Thursday afternoon, leaning over the partition between our desks. "What's going on, man? You and Jenna fighting?" I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. Dave and I had worked together for 5 years, and he knew Jenna. He had been to our house for barbecues, had watched her smile and charm everyone in the room, had told me more than once how lucky I was. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't admit that my marriage was a hollow shell and that I was falling apart on the inside. "Just tired," I lied, "didn't sleep well." Dave gave me a skeptical look but didn't push. He was one of those rare people who knew when to back off, and I was grateful for that. He clapped me on the shoulder and told me to take it easy, then went back to his own work, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The truth was, I hadn't slept well in days. Every night I lay in bed next to Jenna, listening to her breathe, and I replayed that conversation with Lee over and over in my head. I thought about her voice, low and smoky, and the way she had looked at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. I thought about the wall I had built around myself and how she had torn it down in a matter of minutes. I thought about the choice she had said I had to make, and I knew with a sinking feeling that I was already making it. On Friday, I made a decision. I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, and I told Jenna I wasn't feeling well. She barely looked up from her phone as she grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "You should see a doctor," she said, her voice distracted. "There's some soup in the pantry. I'll be late tonight, don't wait up." And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the silent house with nothing but my own restless thoughts. I waited an hour just to make sure she was really gone, and then I got in my car and started driving. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to move, to feel like I was going somewhere, anywhere, instead of just standing still while my life fell apart around me. I ended up at a coffee shop on the other side of town, a place I'd never been before, with mismatched furniture and walls covered in local art. It was the kind of place Jenna would have hated, too bohemian and unpolished, and that was exactly why I chose it. I ordered a black coffee and sat down at a table by the window, watching the rain start to fall outside. The drops streaked down the glass, blurring the world into smudges of color, and I found myself thinking about Lee again. I didn't even know her last name. I didn't know where she lived or what she did for a living. I had no way of finding her, and yet I couldn't let go of the idea that our paths would cross again. It felt inevitable, like a gravitational pull I couldn't resist. My phone buzzed and I glanced at the screen, hoping it was her, even though I knew it couldn't be. It was my mom. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't in the mood for her gentle, probing questions about my marriage and my happiness. She had always been suspicious of Jenna, always sensed something off about her, and I had spent years defending my wife to her. I didn't have the energy to do it anymore. I sat there for 2 hours, nursing my coffee until it went cold, and I came to a realization. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it was so obviously broken. Something had to give, and soon, or I was going to lose myself completely. When I got home, the house was empty. Jenna had left a note on the counter, scrawled in her elegant handwriting. "Gone to a work thing, don't wait up." Work thing, right, the universal code for "I'm out with my lover." I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash, feeling a surge of anger that was hot and sharp and almost welcome. Anger was better than the numbness. Anger meant I still felt something. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat down in the living room, staring at the wall. The house was too quiet, too empty. The silence pressed in on me from all sides, suffocating and heavy. I wanted to call someone, anyone, just to hear a voice, but I didn't have anyone to call. My friends were Jenna's friends. My family was 1,000 miles away. I had let myself become isolated, dependent on a woman who had stopped loving me a long time ago. I drank the whiskey in one gulp and poured another. I was halfway through my third glass when my phone buzzed again. I almost ignored it, but something made me look. It was a text message from an unknown number, and my heart stopped when I read the words. "It's Lee. I got your number from a mutual friend. I hope that's okay." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. She had found me. She had reached out. I didn't know how, and I didn't care. All that mattered was that she was there on the other end of the line, and I had to respond. "Hi," I typed, my fingers clumsy and uncoordinated. "It's fine. I've been thinking about you." The reply came back almost instantly. "I've been thinking about you too. Can we talk?" I called her immediately. I didn't even think about it. My thumb hit the call button before my brain had time to register what I was doing. She answered on the second ring, her voice low and familiar. "Hey," she said, and just that one word made my heart ache. "Hey," I replied, my voice cracking. "I'm so glad you called." "I had to," she said. "I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I couldn't stop thinking about you." The confession hit me like a wave, crashing over me and pulling me under. I leaned back on the couch, closing my eyes, and let myself feel it. The connection, the desire, the terrifying, thrilling possibility of something new. "I feel like I'm going crazy," I admitted. "I feel like I'm drowning, and you're the only one who can save me." Lee was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. "I feel the same way. I know it's crazy. I know we just met, but there's something between us, Mark. I know you feel it too." I didn't deny it. I couldn't. It was the truest thing I'd felt in years. "I want to see you," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I need to see you." There was a pause, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. I could picture her dark hair falling across her face, those gray eyes searching mine. "Come to my place," she said finally. "I'll send you the address tonight." I knew it was wrong. I knew I should say no, that I should hang up the phone and go to bed and pretend this conversation had never happened. But I was tired of doing the right thing. I was tired of being the good husband, the reliable man, the one who always sacrificed his own happiness for the sake of appearances. I was tired of being invisible. "Okay," I said, "I'll be there." She sent me the address, and I got in my car without a second thought. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the streetlights. I drove through the empty roads, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I was doing something insane, something I could never take back, and I didn't care. I didn't care about anything except the magnetic pull of her, the promise of being seen. Her apartment was in an older building, the kind with character and history, a far cry from the sterile, modern high-rises Jenna loved. I parked on the street and walked up the creaking stairs to her door, my legs shaking with every step. I knocked, and she opened it almost immediately, like she had been waiting right behind it. She was wearing a simple gray sweater and jeans, her hair loose and tousled, and she was even more beautiful than I remembered. She smiled when she saw me, a soft, uncertain smile that made my heart ache. "Hey," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Hey," I replied, and then I was inside, and the door was closing behind me, and I was in her apartment, surrounded by her things, her scent, her presence. "I'm glad you came," she said, leading me to the small living room. It was cozy, filled with books and plants and photographs on the walls. It felt lived in, loved, like a real home. "I had to," I said, sitting down on the couch. She sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body. "Tell me what's been going on," she said. "Tell me everything." And I did. I told her about the week of pretending, about the signs of Jenna's affair, about the desperate loneliness that had been eating me alive. She listened the same way she had in the backyard, with her whole attention, her whole self. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge. She just let me talk, and when I was done, she reached out and took my hand. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "You don't have to be invisible." I looked at her, at the sincerity in her eyes, and I felt something break open inside me. The wall I had built around myself, the one that had kept me safe and isolated for so long, crumbled to dust. "I don't want to be invisible," I whispered. "Not anymore." She leaned in, and I met her halfway. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like we were both testing the waters. But then it deepened, and I felt a fire ignite in my chest, a warmth that spread through my whole body. She tasted like coffee and something sweet, and I couldn't get enough. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing hard. I rested my forehead against hers, my eyes closed, and I felt more alive than I had in years. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I don't want to stop." And neither did I. That was the problem. Neither did I. I stayed until the sun started to paint the sky in shades of pink and orange, and even then, leaving felt like ripping off a piece of my own skin. We hadn't slept, not really. We had just talked and touched and kissed until my lips were raw and my heart was so full I thought it might burst. She told me about her ex, a man named Derek, who had drained her of her spirit over the course of 4 years, making her feel small and insignificant until she barely recognized herself. She told me about the day she finally walked out, how she had packed a single bag and driven to her sister's house and cried for 3 days straight. She told me about the loneliness that had followed, the way she had rebuilt herself piece by piece, learning to be alone without being lonely. And I told her things I had never told anyone, not even my closest friends, not even my own mother. I told her about the night I realized I had stopped loving Jenna, the night she had come home late from a work event and I had looked at her and felt nothing but a dull, familiar ache. I told her about the dreams I had given up on, the adventures I had shelved, the version of myself that had withered and died in the shadow of my marriage. When I finally pulled away from her, my body screaming with exhaustion but my mind buzzing with a strange electric clarity, she walked me to the door. She looked tired too, her dark hair mussed, her eyes soft and heavy-lidded, but there was a smile on her face that made my heart skip. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet and sincere, "for trusting me, for being real with me." "Thank you for seeing me," I replied, and the words felt inadequate, too small for the magnitude of what I was feeling. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't reached out." She reached up and touched my face, her palm warm against my cheek. "You would have figured it out," she said. "You're stronger than you think." I wanted to stay. I wanted to cancel the rest of my life and just exist in this moment forever, wrapped in her warmth and her understanding. But I had to go back. I had to face the wreckage of my marriage and figure out what came next. The drive home was surreal, the world passing by in a blur of muted colors. The streets were quiet, the early morning stillness broken only by the occasional bird or the distant hum of a garbage truck. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the house that had never quite felt like home. It was just a structure, a collection of rooms filled with furniture and memories that had soured over time. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to see the evidence of a life I had outgrown, but I did. I walked through the front door and was greeted by silence. Jenna's car was in the driveway, which meant she was home, but the house was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the island with a cup of coffee, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I walked in, and there was something different in her expression, something I couldn't quite read. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice flat. Not accusatory, not concerned, just flat. "I couldn't sleep," I said, the lie coming easily. "Went for a drive." She nodded, accepting the explanation without question. That was the thing about our marriage. We had stopped asking questions a long time ago, stopped caring enough to push for the truth. We were two strangers sharing a roof, two ghosts haunting the same space. "Your mom called," she said, turning back to her phone. "I told her you were sick." "Thanks," I said, pouring myself a glass of water. My hands were still trembling from the night, from the intensity of what I had just experienced. I took a sip, trying to calm my racing heart. Jenna looked up again, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You look like hell, are you sure you're okay?" For a moment, I considered telling her the truth. I considered laying it all out on the table, the loneliness, the distance, the realization that we had both checked out of this marriage a long time ago. I considered confessing my feelings for Lee not out of guilt but out of a desperate need for honesty. But I looked at Jenna, at the careful mask she wore, the way she was already half checked out of the conversation, and I knew it wouldn't matter. She didn't care. She had stopped caring a long time ago. "I'm fine," I said, "just tired." She nodded again, and that was it. That was the extent of our communication. She went back to her phone and I went upstairs to take a shower, standing under the hot water until my skin turned red and my thoughts became a little less sharp. The days that followed were a blur of deception and double lives. I told Jenna I had a work project that required late nights, and she didn't question it. I told my boss I was dealing with some personal issues and needed to leave early, and he didn't pry. I spent every spare moment with Lee, sneaking away like a teenager, feeling the thrill of secrecy and the weight of guilt all at once. We met at her apartment most nights, ordering takeout and talking until the early hours of the morning. We went to parks and coffee shops and quiet bars where no one knew us, where we could exist as just two people falling in love without the baggage of our pasts. And I was falling in love. It hit me like a freight train one evening as I watched her cook dinner in her tiny kitchen, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, humming along to a song on the radio. She turned to look at me and she smiled that soft, uncertain smile, and I knew I was a goner. I was in love with a woman I barely knew, and I was married to a woman I barely recognized. The guilt was there, a constant hum beneath the surface of my joy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was doing something unforgivable, that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. But every time I thought about ending it, every time I considered going back to the hollow shell of my marriage, I felt a surge of panic. I couldn't go back. I couldn't pretend. I had tasted something real and I was addicted. Lee must have sensed my struggle, because one night as we lay tangled together in her bed, she propped herself up on her elbow and looked down at me with those piercing gray eyes. "What are we doing, Mark?" she asked, and there was no judgment in her voice, just curiosity. Where is this going? I didn't have an answer. I had been so caught up in the intensity of our connection that I hadn't thought about the future. I hadn't thought about the practicalities, the logistics, the mess of untangling my life from Jenna's. I had just been living in the moment, basking in the warmth of being seen. "I don't know," I admitted. "I want this, I want you. But I don't know how to make it work." She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing idle patterns on my chest. "I'm not asking for answers right now, I just want to know if you're serious about this, if you're serious about us." I looked at her, at the vulnerability in her eyes, and I knew I had to be honest. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," I said, "but I can't keep hiding, I can't keep sneaking around. I need to end things with Jenna, properly, cleanly." A smile spread across her face, slow and warm. That's all I needed to hear. But the conversation had planted a seed of anxiety in my chest. I knew what I needed to do, I had known it for weeks. But actually doing it, actually sitting Jenna down and telling her that our marriage was over, felt like a monumental task. I was afraid of the fallout, the confrontation, the messy, ugly reality of a divorce. I was afraid of what people would think, of the judgment and the gossip and the pity. I was afraid of losing everything I had built, even if I had built it on a foundation of sand. The final push came on a Tuesday night. I had told Jenna I was working late, but I got home earlier than expected. The driveway was empty, so I let myself in and started to make dinner. I was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of pasta, when I heard the front door open. It wasn't the usual click and slam of Jenna coming home alone. It was a soft, careful opening, followed by the murmur of voices. I froze. My heart started to pound, and I knew with a sickening certainty what I was about to see. I walked into the living room just as Jenna stepped through the door, her hand intertwined with the hand of the tall man from the party, the one with the sharp jawline and the cologne-ad smile. He was kissing her neck, his other hand on her waist, and they were both so wrapped up in each other that they didn't see me standing there. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, watching the scene unfold, feeling a strange sense of detachment. It was like watching a movie, something that was happening to someone else. And then Jenna looked up and her eyes met mine, and the expression on her face was priceless. It was shock, yes, but also something else, something that looked like relief. "Mark," she said, pulling away from the man, "I can explain." "Don't bother," I said, my voice calm and measured. I was surprised by how steady I sounded. "I've known for a while." The tall man was staring at me, his face pale and uncertain. He looked like he wanted to run, and I almost felt sorry for him. He was just a pawn in a game he didn't understand. "Who is this?" I asked, gesturing to him. "Your coworker, your boss, just a random guy you picked up at a bar?" Jenna's face hardened, and I saw a flash of the old fire in her eyes. "His name is Derek," she said, and something clicked in my brain. Derek. Lee's ex-husband, the man who had broken her spirit, drained her of her joy. The universe had a sick sense of humor. "Derek," I repeated, the name tasting bitter on my tongue. Of course it's Derek." Jenna looked confused, but I didn't elaborate. I didn't owe her an explanation. I didn't owe her anything. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold. Privately, I looked at Derek, who was shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Get out," I said. He didn't need to be told twice. He practically ran out the door, leaving me alone with my wife. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jenna walked to the couch and sat down, her face a mask of controlled anger. I remained standing, my arms crossed, my heart pounding in my chest. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you known?" she countered, deflecting. "Or how long has it been going on?" "Both." She let out a bitter laugh. "6 months, and I've known you've been up to something too. All those late nights, all those mysterious calls. Who is she?" I had planned to tell her eventually, but not like this. Not in the middle of a confrontation that had already spiraled out of control. But I was tired of lying, I was tired of hiding. "Her name is Lee," I said. "And yes, something is going on, but you don't get to be angry, Jenna. You don't get to play the victim. You checked out of this marriage a long time ago." "I checked out." She stood up, her face flushed with indignation. "I'm the one who worked to make this life work. I'm the one who kept things together while you moped around like a wounded puppy. You want to talk about checking out? Look in the mirror." The argument that followed was ugly and brutal, years of resentment spilling out like poison. We hurled accusations at each other, tore open old wounds, dredged up every grievance we had ever harbored. It was cathartic and devastating in equal measure, and when it was finally over, when we were both exhausted and hoarse, we looked at each other across the wreckage of our marriage and knew there was no going back. "I want a divorce," I said, the words feeling strange and final. Jenna didn't fight me, she just nodded, her face pale and drawn. "Fine, I'll call a lawyer tomorrow." And just like that, it was over. The life I had built, the life I had clung to for so long, collapsed around me in a heap of rubble. I walked out of the house that night and drove straight to Lee's apartment, knocking on her door with trembling hands. She opened it, took one look at my face, and pulled me into her arms. "It's over," I said, my voice breaking. "It's finally over." She held me tight, stroking my hair, whispering reassurances. And in her arms, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope.
যে যাবার সে যাবে চলে, তারে নিয়া ভাইবো না, তারে নিয়া ভাবলেই বাড়বে কষ্ট যন্ত্রণা। যে যাবার সে যাবে চলে, তারে নিয়া ভাইবো না, তারে নিয়া ভাবলেই বাড়বে কষ্ট যন্ত্রণা। এত ভালোবাসার পরেও পাইলাম না তার মন, আমারে সারিয়া বেইমান ধরছে আরেকজন। হাত বান্ধিব, পা বান্ধিব, মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া, একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া। হাত বান্ধিব, পা বান্ধিব, মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া, একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া, একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া। যাকে তাকে দেখে তাহার লেগে যায় রে ভালা, মুখে তাহার মধু অন্তর বিষেতে ভরা। যাকে তাকে দেখে তাহার লেগে যায় রে ভালা, মুখে তাহার মধু অন্তর বিষেতে ভরা। মিষ্টি কথার মায়া জালে কইরা আমন্ত্রণ, আমার কলজা খাওয়ায় তাদের কইরা নিমন্ত্রণ। হাত বান্ধিব, পা বান্ধিব, মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া, একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া। হাত বান্ধিব, পা বান্ধিব, মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া, একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া, একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া। গাটের পানি যাহার খাইয়াই অবস্থ, এক গাটেতে সে কিভাবে থাকবে রে অস্ত। 12 গাটের পানি যাহার খাইয়াই অবস্থ, এক গাটেতে সে কিভাবে থাকবে রে অস্ত। তাহার কাছে ভালোবাসার নাই রে কোনো দাম, আমার মনটা ভাঙ্গা বেইমান করলো রে খান খান। হাত বান্ধিব পা বান্ধিব মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া, একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া। হাত বান্ধিব পা বান্ধিব মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া, একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া। একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া। যে যাবার সে চলে যাবে তারে নিয়া ভাইব না, তারে নিয়া ভাবলেই বাড়বে কষ্ট যন্ত্রণা। যে যাবার সে চলে যাবে তারে নিয়া ভাইব না, তারে নিয়া ভাবলেই বাড়বে কষ্ট যন্ত্রণা। এত ভালোবাসার পরেও পাইলাম না তার মন, আমারে সারিয়া বেইমান ধরছে আর একজন। হাত বান্ধিব পা বান্ধিব মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া, একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া। হাত বান্ধিব পা বান্ধিব মন বান্ধিব কি দিয়া, একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে দিয়া। একটা মন তার 12 জনকে রাখছে রে